The bucket of water slipped from her frozen hands and shattered against the stones of the watering trough, just as the largest horse in the stable decided to rear up a meter from her face. She didn't scream. She just stood there, her skirts soaked to the knees, looking the animal in the eye as if it were the simplest thing in the world to calm 1,000-pound beast with a voice cracked by the dawn's chill. And then, from the shadow of the barn, a man who hadn't slept in 2 nights because of that very mare held his breath. Not out of fear that the horse would hurt her, but because, for the first time in a long time, something in his chest stirred from a place that had been locked for years. The ranch was called Hollow Pine, and it lay in a valley so far from any main road that mail took 11 days to arrive and another 11 to return with a reply. Caleb Ashworth was 38 years old, with hands like tanned leather and a house too large for one man. He had inherited the land from his father, and with the land, he had also inherited the debts, the long silences at the table, and a habit he could never shake, the one of not asking anyone for help, even when he desperately needed it. 3 years ago, he had buried his wife, Margaret, under the oldest oak tree on the property, and since then the house had smelled different. Not of sadness exactly, of waiting, as if everything from the curtains to the empty chairs was waiting for someone to give purpose to the days again. He ran the ranch with the help of 2 farmhands who came and went with the seasons, and with the stubbornness of someone who believes that work, if there's enough of it, can fill any void. It didn't fill it. But Caleb had grown used to pretending it did. The woman in the stable was named Edith Calloway, and she had arrived at Hollow Pine 2 weeks earlier with a letter of recommendation from a ranch 4 counties away and a mule as thin as she was, 32 years old, with hands that already knew the work of the land long before arriving there, and a story she told no one, though everyone in the nearby village, barely a handful of houses around a church and a store, whispered that a woman alone doesn't travel that far without running from something or someone. Caleb didn't ask. That was perhaps the first thing she noticed about him, that he didn't ask. He needed someone who knew about animals, who could stay in the small cabin by the river while he took care of the rest. And Edith arrived with a recommendation that simply said, "Works like 10 men and speaks like none." That was enough for Caleb, who preferred the silence of a good worker to the company of one who talked too much. What neither of them knew that first week was that shared silence can also become a language, and that language, with time, begins to say things that neither of them dares to translate out loud. They had actually met in the most nondescript way possible. She got off the mule, he pointed out the cabin to her, showed her where the tools were, and warned her about the black mare that no one in the county had managed to ride. Edith nodded, left her things, and the next day she was already in the corral, speaking softly to the mare, without touching her yet, just letting the animal get used to her presence. Caleb watched her from afar that first morning, leaning against the fence, and thought that there was something in the way she waited, without haste, without needing to prove anything, that reminded him of something he himself had lost a long time ago. He couldn't name it yet. He only knew he couldn't stop looking. Edith, for her part, saw something in Caleb that she hadn't expected to find in the owner of such a large ranch. Weariness, yes, but also a kind of quiet care for everything he touched. The way he repaired a fence, not as an obligation, but almost as an act of respect for the wood itself. The way he left extra food for the neighboring ranch's dogs without being asked. Small gestures that a bitter man wouldn't make. Neither of them said any of this, not that week nor the next. But something had been sown, almost unintentionally, in the common ground between two people who had decided, each in their own way, that they no longer expected anything from life except work and silence. Mornings at Hollow Pine began before the sky finished deciding its color. Caleb milked, Edith fed the horses, and mid-morning they would meet at the well, where she would fill the buckets, and he, without being asked, began carrying the heaviest ones to the stable. The first time he did it, Edith looked at him with a raised eyebrow, ready to say she could do it herself. But something in Caleb's expression, that way he didn't look her in the eye while doing it, as if he feared she would tell him it wasn't necessary, made her fall silent and simply nod. Thus began an unspoken routine. He carried the heaviest buckets. She left the best part of the porch's shade for when he returned from the field, exhausted, at noon. He fixed the leak in the cabin without her noticing until the next night, when it rained and the roof, for the first time in months, didn't drip onto the bed. She, in turn, started leaving hot coffee on the porch of the big house before Caleb came down, in a tin thermos she had bought with her first payment. They were small gestures, so small that anyone who saw them from the outside would have called them simple courtesy between an employer and an employee. But both knew, in that silent place in their chest where one keeps truths they don't want to face directly, that this was something else. One afternoon, while they were repairing a wind-fallen fence together, their hands brushed as they held the same post. Neither withdrew it immediately. It was barely a second, perhaps two, but in that second the air seemed to thicken, like before a storm that hasn't yet decided if it will break. "I've got it," Caleb finally said, withdrawing his hand. "I know," Edith replied, and in her voice there was something that was neither reproach nor surprise. It was, rather, the calm confirmation of something they both already suspected. But neither of them said anything more that afternoon. They put away the tools, finished dinner in silence, each in their own space, and went to sleep with the weight of a question that neither dared to ask yet. It was around those days that something changed, although neither of them could pinpoint the exact moment. Perhaps it was the night the black mare, the one no one could ride, allowed Edith to touch her for the first time, and Caleb, seeing it from the kitchen window, felt something in his chest loosen, like a rope that had been taut for years. Or perhaps it was the morning Edith found, folded under the cabin door, a thick blanket she had never asked for, and knew, without anyone telling her, who had left it there. But the truth is that, from then on, the silences between them began to carry a different weight. They were no longer empty silences. They were silences filled with something that neither of them yet knew how to name, nor if they had the right to name it. Autumn arrived at Hollow Pine with an urgency that offered no respite. The crops had to be harvested before the first frosts, and this year, moreover, news arrived that put the entire valley on edge. A land buyer from the east, a man named Holt Brennan, had begun offering generous sums for the smaller and deaded ranches in the area, promising to modernize the region with railroads and new trade routes. For many neighbors, it was a way out. For Caleb, it was a direct threat. Hollow Pine had an old debt, inherited from his father, that he had been paying in silent installments for years, and Brennan knew exactly how much he owed. "I'm offering you twice what your land is worth," Brennan told him one afternoon, standing by his horse, with the tone of someone who had already calculated all possible answers. and I'll let you stay in the house until spring if you wish. It's a generous offer, Ashworth. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked towards the stable where Edith was working, unaware that her future, at that moment, was being decided in a conversation that didn't include her. "This land is not for sale," he said finally. "All land is for sale," Brennan replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's just a matter of finding the right price. And you, with that debt, you don't have much time to decide yours." Brennan left that afternoon, but the threat remained, settling into every corner of the house like a dampness that couldn't be dried. Caleb started working later, talking less, carrying a weight on his shoulders that Edith noticed immediately, though he didn't say a word about it. She, who knew well what it meant to carry a secret without naming it, decided not to ask directly. Instead, she began to stay longer in the stable at night, finishing tasks that weren't strictly necessary, just to be near when Caleb finally emerged from the office where he kept the account books, his eyes reddened by hours and figures that didn't add up. One night, she found him sitting on the porch steps, with an unopened bottle of whiskey beside him, looking towards the oak under which Margaret rested. "Are you going to sell it?" Edith asked, sitting at a respectful distance without asking permission. Caleb took a moment to answer. "This land is the only thing I have left from my father. And from her," he said, nodding towards the oak. "But debts don't understand feelings." "Nothing worthwhile understands feelings," Edith replied. "That doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for." Caleb looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time since she arrived. And in that moment, neither of them could avoid thinking that the conversation was no longer just about the land. It was precisely in those days, as the uncertainty about the ranch's future grew like a shadow over every decision, that they both began to notice something else. The fear of loss wasn't just about the land. It was also about the possibility of losing each other before they had even fully found each other. The psychologist Brené Brown, in her research on vulnerability, described how the fear of anticipated loss, what she calls diminished joy, leads many people to hold back even in the face of happiness, for fear that acknowledging it will make it more painful to lose. That was exactly what kept Caleb silent for weeks, even when every part of him wanted to say what he felt. The following days brought more pressure. Brennan returned twice more, each time with a slightly different offer, each time with a shorter deadline. The neighbors began to sell, one after another, and the valley that had once been full of family ranches began to fill with signs announcing new constructions, new routes, a future that didn't include people like Caleb. Edith, meanwhile, discovered that the youngest farmhand on the neighboring ranch, a boy named Doyle, had started making excuses to visit Hollow Pine with increasing frequency, always with the barely concealed intention of courting her. He was kind, hard-working, and offered her something Caleb had never offered her out loud: certainty. Doyle spoke of a future, of a home of their own, of a commitment that required no guesswork. "I could have a quiet life with him," Edith told the black mare one night, as she brushed her slowly, as if the animal could understand the weight of her own doubts. "A life without so much silence." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The quiet life Doyle offered had nothing to do with what she felt when Caleb offered his hand to help her down from the wagon, or when, without a word, he left the last piece of pie on her plate during dinner. Time was running out. Brennan had set the first day of frost as the deadline, which at Hollow Pine usually arrived earlier than in any other valley in the region. And as the harvest was gathered, as the entire ranch raced against the clock to secure enough grain and hay to survive the winter. Two people continued without saying the only thing that truly mattered. The night they finished gathering the last hay wagon, exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, Caleb stood looking at Edith as she took off her work gloves, laughing at something he had said without thinking too much. A clumsy comment about how stubborn the black mare was, comparing her without realizing it to herself. And in that laugh, in that simple gesture of taking off her gloves in the orange light of dusk, Caleb felt something inside him break once and for all. It wasn't the fear of losing the ranch that terrified him most that night. It was the real, concrete possibility that Edith would accept Doyle's visits. That one day she would decide certainty was worth more than shared silence, and that he would be left, once again, in a house too large, waiting for something that would never return. That night, after Edith retired to the cabin, Caleb sat alone in the kitchen with a candle as his only company. And for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to think of Margaret not with guilt, but with a kind of silent permission. He remembered something she had told him months before she got sick. The day you're afraid of losing something again, you'll know you're truly alive again. He also thought about the last few months, about the number of small decisions he had made without naming them for what they were. The time he fixed the cabin roof before the rain came, not because it was his obligation as the boss, but because the idea of her being cold was, quite simply, intolerable. The time he learned, without anyone teaching him, to distinguish the sound of her footsteps on the porch wood, and to know just by the rhythm of those steps whether she had had a good day or a difficult one. None of those gestures had been intended as courtship, and yet, added one after another, they formed something he could no longer call a simple habit. He also recalled the afternoon Brennan casually mentioned, almost as an inconsequential comment, that he had seen Doyle talking to Edith by the mill, and how that sentence, said without particular malice, had churned his stomach in a way no number in the account books had managed. It wasn't jealousy, he told himself that night, trying to be honest. Or not just jealousy. It was the concrete, physical fear of imagining the house without the sound of her steps on the porch, without the tin thermos waiting for him each morning, without that presence that had become, without his deciding it, as necessary as air. Caleb stared at the candle flame for a long time, and when he finally stood up, he knew that something in him had decided, without the need for grandiloquent words, that he no longer wanted to be afraid in silence. And you, from what country are you watching us tonight? Write it in the comments, because no matter where you are, this story, like all those that deserve to be told, speaks a language we all understand. The next morning, Caleb found Edith in the stable, as every day, brushing the black mare with that seemingly bottomless patience. He stood at the entrance for a moment, watching her, before speaking. Doyle was here yesterday, he said, without preamble, his voice rougher than he intended. Edith didn't turn immediately. She continued brushing, though her hands moved a little slower. He came to ask if he could take me to the county fair next month. And what did you tell him? That I would think about it. Caleb felt the weight of that answer like a stone in his chest. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the dry straw. And have you thought about it? Edith finally turned, and in her eyes there was something that wasn't doubt, but a kind of honest weariness, like that of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right question to be asked by the right person. Caleb. Her name, spoken like that, without title or distance, sounded different than it had before. I've been here for 5 months. I've carried water with you every morning. I've fixed fences with you every afternoon. I've eaten at your table every night. And in all that time, you've never asked me what I want. You only ask me what Doyle said. The truth of it hit him with the force of something he had been avoiding for too long. Caleb lowered his gaze for an instant, and when he raised it again, there was something different on his face. The decision, finally, to stop hiding behind Prudence. You're right, he said. I haven't asked you what you want, because I was afraid of the answer. Afraid of what? That the answer wouldn't be me. The stable fell silent, except for the soft snort of the mare, who seemed, too, to be waiting. 3 years ago I lost Margaret, Caleb continued, his voice breaking just enough to sound real. And since then, I convinced myself that this house, this ranch, was all I was going to have. That work would be enough. But then you arrived, with your thin mule and your letter of recommendation, and since then I haven't been able to convince myself of anything. Edith set the brush aside, slowly, like someone resting something fragile. I don't want you to tell me this because you're afraid of losing me to Doyle, she said. I want you to tell me because it's true. It's true, Caleb replied, without hesitation this time. Every morning I carry those buckets. I don't do it because you're my employee. I do it because I want to be near you as much as possible, even if it's just carrying water. Every night I leave the last piece of pie on your plate. It's not courtesy. It's because I want you to know that I think of you, even in the smallest things. Edith felt something in her chest loosen, like a rope that had been taut for too long. I'm afraid, Caleb, she admitted, and it was the first time she had shown such fragility in front of him. I've spent my life moving from one place to another, never staying long enough for anything to truly matter to me. It's easier that way. It hurts less. And now? Now it matters to me to stay. And that scares me more than anything else I've felt in years. Caleb took the last step that separated them, and for the first time, with no excuse of work or weather mediating between them, he took Edith's hands in his. Then stay, he said simply. Not as an employee. Stay because I want to build something with you. I don't know exactly what form it will take, but I know I don't want it to have the form of a life without you in it. Edith didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, her eyes shining with something that wasn't entirely tears, and for a moment that seemed eternal, neither of them said anything. It was a different kind of silence than all the previous ones. Not one of waiting, but of shared certainty. The kind of silence that says more than any rehearsed speech. Finally, Edith nodded, barely, and that was her answer. Caleb drew her towards him, slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wished. She didn't pull back. And when their lips finally met, it was a clumsy, brief gesture, without the elegance of the romances told in books, but with all the honesty of two people who had stopped pretending they didn't feel what they felt. The land crisis didn't disappear that afternoon, but something in Caleb changed. The next day, he went into town and spoke with the bank, negotiated an extension, offered some of the livestock as additional collateral. It wasn't a magical or instantaneous solution, but it was enough to buy time. The time he needed to build, with Edith, something more solid than any of Brennan's offers. The weeks that followed brought a new kind of routine, this time openly shared. Edith left the cabin by the river and moved into the big house, not immediately as a wife, but first as a life partner, as they both discovered the rhythm of building something together, without haste, without the urgency that had marked the first months. They married in the spring, in a small ceremony under the oak where Margaret rested, because Caleb wanted her, in some way, to be part of this new beginning too. Edith didn't see it as a shadow on her happiness, but as a testament that love, when it is real, doesn't erase what came before. It simply makes space for the new. The ranch work transformed into something different from then on. It was no longer just about survival. Edith brought knowledge that Caleb didn't have, new ways of raising cattle, techniques she had learned in her years of travel, a fresh perspective on a land he knew too well to see with new eyes. Together, they achieved what Caleb alone had not been able to, making Hollow Pine cease to be simply an inherited debt and become something prosperous, built by the hands of both. The black mare, the one no one had been able to ride, finally accepted the saddle, but only from Edith. Caleb joked that the animal had better judgment than most people in town, because she had recognized the right person from the first day. The small gestures didn't disappear with the marriage. If anything, they multiplied. Caleb continued to carry the heaviest buckets, though now he did it without the excuse of work, simply because he wanted to. Edith continued to leave hot coffee on the porch, though now they shared it together, sitting side by side, watching the dawn break over a valley they finally felt was their own. 22 years later, the oak under which they had married had grown so much that its shade covered almost the entire backyard of the house. Hollow Pine was no longer the indebted and silent ranch Caleb had inherited from his father. It was a prosperous property, known throughout the region for the quality of its cattle and for a black mare, now old, who still didn't let anyone but Edith ride her. In those 22 years, many things had happened that time, with its habit of smoothing the rough edges of memories, had turned into anecdotes told with laughter during dinners. The winter they lost almost half the cattle and had to start again with barely a dozen head. The spring when a distant nephew of Caleb's arrived unannounced and ended up staying 3 years learning the trade. The time Brennan, now elderly and without the fortune he once boasted, passed through the valley asking for work, and Caleb, with no visible resentment, offered him a season of labor because some wounds, with enough time, stop hurting enough to forgive. Caleb's hair was now completely white, and his hands, though still strong, showed the marks of 6 decades of work. Edith, sitting beside him on the same porch where so many difficult conversations had taken place, still had that same infinite patience in her gaze, though now the wrinkles around her eyes told a different story. A story of shared laughter, of winters survived together, of a life built brick by brick, gesture by gesture. The tin thermos, dented and with the enamel worn at the edges, was still used every morning. Edith had replaced it twice over the years, but always with one almost identical, because Caleb, without saying it directly, seemed to cling to that small ritual as if it were physical proof that everything else, the intangible, was also still true. That autumn afternoon, as the sun set behind the mountains surrounding the valley, Caleb reached out his hand without a word, the same gesture he had made thousands of times over the years, and Edith, without needing to look, placed her hand on his. Their fingers, intertwined, showed the same callus in the same place, formed by years of carrying the same buckets, of holding the same reins, of building together a life that neither of them had imagined possible that first morning, when a bucket of water shattered against the stones and a horse reared in front of a stranger who was not afraid. "Do you regret anything?" Edith asked, as she used to ask every autumn, almost like a ritual between them. Caleb smiled, that slow smile that only appeared with her. "Only one thing," he replied, as always, "for taking so long to ask you what it was that you wanted." The air that afternoon smelled of freshly cut hay and the wood that was already beginning to burn in the fireplace for dinner. Somewhere in the corral, the black mare snorted, old and slow, but still there, a silent witness to all that had grown around her since that first cold morning. And as the sky turned that deep orange that exists only in valleys surrounded by mountains, neither of them felt the need to say anything more. They had spent 22 years learning that shared silence, when it is made of the right material, can say more than any speech. And so, year after year, on that same porch, under that same oak tree, two people who once believed that love was something reserved for others, for the younger, for those who had not yet lost anything, demonstrated that true love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives carrying a bucket of water, in silence, asking nothing in return, simply because there is someone we want to spare the weight, even if only a little, for the rest of the journey. Because in the end, that's what remains when everything else fades. Not grandiloquent words, not promises written in letters that take 11 days to arrive, but hands that seek each other at the end of the day, without needing to ask, without needing to explain, that silent certainty that no matter what happens, there is someone willing to stay.